The forest is quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that feels wrong, that feels alive. The crickets have gone still, the wind holds its breath. And then you hear it, low at first, distant, like a storm crawling over the hills, a howl, long, mournful and hungry. It echoes through the trees, curling down into your bones. You tell yourself it's just a wolf, a natural predator, nothing more. But deep down, something older than reason stirs in your chest. Fear, not of the animal itself, but of the possibility that the thing out there in the dark is not just a wolf, that it wears a face, that it walks upright, that it is a beast wearing the skin of a man. The villagers knew. For centuries they whispered warnings by firelight. Don't walk under the full moon. Don't linger in the woods at night. Don't trust the neighbor who comes home with blood under his nails and eyes that glow too bright. They believed in the curse, in the sickness of the soul that could twist a man into something inhuman. And they knew the signs: shredded clothes, broken bodies, the sound of claws scraping on your door just before dawn. The werewolf is not a story. It is a nightmare as old as the campfire, a reminder that beneath every calm human face lies the possibility of a beast, wild, ravenous, unstoppable. When the moon rises and the howl splits the night, it is already too late. The change has begun. And the thing that was once a man will come for you, and nothing, no prayer, no lock, no weapon will keep it out. Before the silver bullet, before the full moon, before the very word werewolf was ever whispered in the dark, the fear was already there. It coiled in the deepest, most primal parts of the human mind, a cold, ancient terror. It was the fear of the wolf. For hundreds of thousands of years, the wolf was not just an animal. It was a god. It was a demon. It was the shadow that stalked the edges of the campfire, its eyes burning like embers in the darkness. It was hunger given a shape, a brutal, intelligent predator that moved with a chilling silence and attacked with a savage ferocity that could tear a man, a woman, or a child limb from limb. The howl of the wolf, echoing through the desolate, primeval forests, was the sound of nature's indifference, the sound of your own vulnerability, the sound of impending death. Humanity was not at the top of the food chain then. We were just another meal. And from this raw, visceral, and deeply personal fear of the wolf, a darker, more insidious terror began to grow. What if the predator that stalked the night was not just a beast? What if it was a man? What if the monster that tore out your throat had once shared your bed, your bread, your name? This was the genesis of the shapeshifter myth, the horrifying thought that the line between man and beast was not a solid wall, but a fragile, permeable membrane. Our journey into these ancient roots takes us first to the cold, windswept lands of the Norsemen, a people forged in the crucible of a harsh and unforgiving world. Here, the wolf was not just a feared animal. It was a figure of immense symbolic power. In their mythology, the monstrous wolf Fenrir, son of Loki, was destined to break his chains and devour Odin himself, bringing about Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The wolf was chaos. The wolf was destruction. The wolf was the end of the world. And it was from this profound reverence and terror that a warrior class emerged, men who sought to channel the primal, destructive power of the wolf into themselves. These were the berserkers. The word itself, shrouded in the mists of history, likely meant bear shirts or bear sarks, referring to the animal skins they wore. But their behavior was that of the wolf. They were warriors who would enter battle in a terrifying, trance-like fury, a state of mind where they shed their humanity and became pure, unadulterated instruments of violence. They would foam at the mouth, bite their shields, and charge into battle naked or clad only in animal skins, seemingly impervious to pain, fighting with the strength and ferocity of enraged beasts. The sagas describe their terrifying transformation. They would become wolf skulls, their minds replaced by the primal instincts of the predator. They would howl, they would snarl, they would rend their enemies with a savage joy. They were men, but they were no longer human. They were shapeshifters, not of flesh and bone, but of mind and spirit. They embodied the terrifying idea that a man, under the right circumstances, under the right fury, could become the wolf. This was the spiritual werewolf, the beast within, unleashed through a ritualistic embrace of pure, unthinking rage. Their transformation was a choice, a terrifying act of will. a deliberate surrender to the primal chaos of the wolf. But the most famous and chilling origin story of shapeshifting, the one that introduces the terrible concept of lycanthropy as a curse, comes from the sun-drenched classical world of ancient Greece. And its central figure is a king so cruel, so contemptuous of the gods that he would provoke the wrath of Zeus himself. This is the story of King Lycaon. Lycaon was the king of Arcadia, a land of wild mountains and dense forests. He was, by all accounts, a tyrannical ruler, famous for his impiety, his savagery, and his cannibalistic appetites. The rumors of his cruelty reached the ears of Zeus, the king of the gods. Zeus, ever vigilant for human impiety, decided to descend to earth in disguise, to test Lycaon, and to see if the rumors were true. Zeus, in the humble guise of a weary traveler, arrives at Lycaon's palace. He is welcomed, as is the custom, and given food and drink. But Lycaon, ever the skeptic, ever the sadist, begins to suspect that his guest is more than just a mortal man. He decides to put the god to a test. He decides to offer Zeus a meal so vile, so utterly blasphemous, that it would prove once and for all whether his guest was divine or merely mortal. While Zeus was resting, Lycaon ordered his servants to kill a young boy, a hostage or a servant. He had the boy's body butchered and cooked, and then served the human flesh to Zeus, disguised amongst other meats. It was the ultimate act of sacrilege, a direct challenge to the gods, a defiant act of cannibalism. But Zeus, being a god, saw through the disguise. He knew immediately what he was being served. His rage was swift, absolute, and terrifying. He overturned the table, scattering the profane meal across the floor. He brought down a furious storm of thunder and lightning, burning Lycaon's palace to ashes, destroying his family and slaughtering his servants. But for Lycaon himself, Zeus had a far more personal and poetic punishment in mind. He did not kill him, he cursed him. "You have tasted human flesh," Zeus thundered, his voice shaking the heavens, "and so you shall remain what you are, a beast." As Zeus spoke, Lycaon began to transform. His clothes tore as his body swelled. His smooth skin became coarse and hairy, his hands and feet contorted into paws, his fingers and toes becoming claws. His mouth stretched into a long lupine muzzle, his teeth sharpened into fangs. His human voice was replaced by a guttural growl, then by a long, mournful howl. The king who delighted in consuming human flesh was turned into a wolf, a creature forever driven by the same savage hunger he had once so cruelly indulged. He was condemned to roam the wilderness, forever a beast, a living monument to human impiety and divine retribution. This story is foundational. It establishes several key elements that would define the werewolf myth for centuries. First, it introduces the idea of the transformation as a divine curse, a punishment from the gods for a heinous sin. It is not a choice, like the berserkers trance, but an involuntary, agonizing metamorphosis. Second, it explicitly links the werewolf to cannibalism, to the consumption of human flesh, establishing a core, unspeakable horror that would resonate throughout the mythos. And third, it highlights the profound loss of humanity, the tragic descent from man to beast, a descent that is often agonizing and irreversible. Lycaon, the king, became Lycaon, the wolf, forever trapped in a body that reflected the beast within. But the shapeshifter myth, and the werewolf in particular, was not just a terrifying story. It was a complex and deeply symbolic reflection of human existence in a brutal world. The wolf, as we have said, was a primal fear, but it was also a creature of the wilderness, a symbol of freedom, of instinct, of a savagery that humanity had tried so hard to tame within itself. The early myths of shapeshifting often served as a way to understand and categorize the inexplicable, the terrifying contradictions of human nature. Why would a man suddenly go mad and attack his neighbors with bestial fury? Why would a community suddenly turn on an outsider, seeing them as something less than human? The idea of a man transforming into a wolf provided a potent, if horrifying, explanation. It was a way to understand the terrifying potential for violence and savagery that lurked just beneath the thin veneer of human civilization. In many ancient cultures, wolves were also seen as symbols of chaos, of nature unchecked, of the forces that defied human order and control. The werewolf then became the ultimate embodiment of this chaos. It was the human form, the very symbol of order and reason, suddenly overwhelmed and corrupted by the savage, untamed power of the wild. It was a nightmare that walked on two legs and then, with a horrifying snap of bone and muscle, ran. The werewolf was also a potent symbol of divine punishment. In the heavily religious societies of the ancient world, and later in the medieval period, misfortune was rarely seen as accidental. It was often interpreted as a direct result of human sin, of impiety, of a transgression against God or the gods. A man cursed to become a wolf was not just suffering a terrible fate, he was being punished. He was suffering for his crimes, for his cruelty, for his defiance of the natural and divine order. He was a living sermon, a terrifying reminder to the community to walk the path of righteousness, lest they too incur the wrath of the heavens. These ancient roots, the primal fear of the wolf, the warrior's embrace of the beast within, the divine curse of King Lycaon, and the profound symbolism of chaos and punishment were the dark, fertile soil from which the terrifying plant of the werewolf myth would grow. It was a myth that would adapt, that would evolve, that would change its shape and its skin to reflect the changing anxieties of each new generation. But its core, its savage heart, would remain eternally the same, the horrifying terror of the human animal. The fear that the beast inside us is always waiting for the right moment, for the right moon, to break free and devour everything we thought made us human. The old gods were dead, their marble temples shattered and ground into dust. The new god, the one true god, ruled from on high, but his world was a place of shadows, a place of deep and suffocating fear. This was the Middle Ages, a long, dark night of the soul where life was a short, brutal prelude to an eternity of either blinding, unimaginable light or, far more likely, unimaginable and eternal fire. In this world, the werewolf was not a myth. It was not a story told to frighten children into obedience. It was a fact. It was as real as the plague that swept through your village, turning your neighbors into blackened, weeping corpses. It was as real as the hunger that gnawed at your belly in the dead of winter. It was as real as the devil himself. The ancient poetic monster of the Greek kings and the Norse warriors had crawled out of the pages of the old stories and was now walking in the minds of the people as a creature of flesh, blood, and profound, unforgivable sin. The world was a battlefield. God and Satan were locked in an eternal cosmic war for the souls of humankind. And every dark forest, every isolated village, every single human heart was a contested and bloody territory. The devil was not a distant abstract concept, a theological problem to be debated by scholars. He was a constant, intimate, and seductive presence. He was in the blight that shriveled the crops in your field. He was in the fever that stole the breath from your child in the night. And he was, most terrifyingly of all, in your neighbor. He was in the quiet, lonely woman who lived at the edge of the village, the one who knew too much about herbs. He was in the strange, brooding man who kept to himself, whose eyes held a flicker of some dark, inner fire. He was always looking for the cracks in the world, the cracks in the human soul, to seep through and spread his corruption. And it was in this fertile black soil of absolute faith and absolute fear that the great European witch trials began to take root, a choking plague of paranoia and accusation that would last for centuries. This was an age of chaos, of uncertainty. The old world was dying and the new one was being born in blood and fire. The church, the one great, unshakable pillar of their world, was fighting to maintain its absolute grip on the minds and souls of men. And in this raging storm of change and anxiety, a scapegoat was needed. A simple, easily identifiable enemy to blame for all the world's ills. And that enemy was the witch. The witch, the inquisitors and the priests told them from the pulpit, was a traitor to the human race. A man or a woman who had willingly, greedily, and damnably made a pact with the devil, selling their immortal soul in exchange for a taste of his dark, earthly power. They could curdle the milk in your churn with a single hateful glance. They could summon a hailstorm in the middle of summer to flatten the harvest and bring famine to your door. and they could, through the power of a demonic pact or a foul magical ointment, shed their own human skin and take on the form of a beast, a cat to spy in the night, a bat to carry dark messages, or, most terrifyingly of all, a great, savage, and eternally hungry wolf. Suddenly, the werewolf was no longer just a figure from a ghost story. It was a piece of evidence in a criminal trial. It was a specific, prosecutable, and damning charge. The ancient, primal fear of the shapeshifter had been codified, legalized, and transformed into a guaranteed death sentence. To be accused of being a werewolf was not to be accused of being a monster. It was to be accused of being a heretic, a soldier in Satan's army, a traitor to God and to all of humankind. And the punishment for that was not a silver bullet, it was the fire. And no story illustrates this terrible, new, and very real reality more perfectly, more brutally than the true and terrible case of Peter Stump, the man who would become infamous throughout all of Christendom as the Werewolf of Bedburg. The year is 1589. The place is a small, rural farming community near the town of Bedburg in Germany. For years, this quiet, peaceful region had been living in a state of siege, terrorized by a creature of unimaginable and almost supernatural savagery. It was a wolf, they said, but it was no normal wolf. It was a great, hulking beast, far larger than any wolf they had ever seen, a creature that moved with a chilling, unnatural intelligence and cunning, and that seemed to be possessed by a demonic, bloodthirsty rage. It did not just kill to eat, it killed for the sheer, ecstatic and unholy joy of slaughtering their livestock for years, tearing the throats out of sheep and cattle and leaving their mangled, half-eaten corpses in the fields as a gruesome, mocking display. But then, it had turned its attention to the people. It had begun to hunt the most vulnerable. A child, out tending the geese by the river, was found dead, their small body ripped to pieces. A young woman, walking home from a neighboring village at dusk, was dragged into the woods, her screams cut short, her savaged remains found days later by a horrified search party. The terror was a palpable, living thing in the town. It was a cold dread that settled in with the evening fog. The people were afraid to leave their homes after dark. They barred their doors, they sharpened their axes, and they prayed. The Beast of Bedburg, they called it, a demon sent from hell in the shape of a wolf. And then, one day, a group of hunters, their nerves hardened into steel by years of fear and loss, finally cornered the beast. They saw it in a field, a massive, dark, wolf-like creature, its fur matted with the blood of its latest victim. They and their dogs, a pack of huge, ferocious wolfhounds, gave chase. The creature was fast, cunning, but they were relentless, their fear now burned away and replaced by a cold, righteous fury. They surrounded it. It was trapped. It turned on them, its eyes glowing with a hateful green fire in the dying light, its lips pulled back in a silent, terrifying snarl. And then, as they closed in for the kill, as the dogs leaped and the men raised their spears, they witnessed a miracle. A dark, terrifying, and satanic miracle. Before their very eyes, the great beast, the wolf, seemed to shimmer in the air, to convulse, as if in the grip of some terrible, internal agony. And it changed. The wolf's form melted away, the fur receding, the snout shortening, the hunched animalistic posture straightening into that of a man. And in its place stood a human, a local man, a quiet, respectable, and widowed farmer named Peter Stump. He was missing his left hand, a detail that would become horrifyingly significant. One of the hunting dogs, in the chaos and the fury of the chase, had managed to bite off the wolf's left forepaw. And now, the man who stood before them, naked and trembling, was clutching the bloody, severed stump of his own left wrist. The hunters, in a state of profound shock, of religious terror, of a sudden dawning and holy fury, seized him. The monster had a face, the monster had a name, and it was one of them. It had walked among them, it had shared their bread, it had mourned at their funerals, and then, in the night, it had hunted them. Peter Stump was brought before the magistrates. And he was put to the question. He was tortured. Under the relentless, agonizing, and soul-shattering persuasion of the rack, a confession was ripped from him, a confession so detailed, so vile, so utterly and completely demonic, that the scribes who wrote it down were said to have fainted from the sheer horror of the words. He told them that he had been a practicing sorcerer, a servant of the darkness since he was 12 years old. He told them that he had despaired of God and had made a pact with the devil, who had appeared to him in the deep woods as a great, shadowy figure, promising him all the worldly pleasures he could desire. He said that the devil had given him a magic belt, woven from the soft, grey fur of a wolf. And when he put on this belt, it did not just cover his body, it became his body. He would transform instantly into the shape of a greedy, devouring wolf, with eyes that glowed in the night like brands of fire, and a strength 10 times that of any man. And in this form, he confessed, he had given himself over, body and soul, to a life of pure, unrestrained, and satanic evil. He admitted to the slaughter of the livestock. He admitted to the murder of at least 16 people, including men, women, and children. He confessed to atrocities that defied the very laws of God and man. He admitted to tearing the unborn fetuses from the wombs of 2 pregnant women and devouring their hearts, raw and bloody. And then came the final and most monstrous part of his confession. A part that turned the horror inward, that revealed a rottenness so deep and so profound that it shocked even the hardened inquisitors. He confessed to a long-standing, incestuous relationship with his own daughter. And he confessed to a crime so unnatural, so utterly beyond the pale of human depravity, that it sealed his damnation for all eternity. He confessed to the murder of his own son. He told them that his son had once discovered him in the act of his sin, and to silence him he had, in his wolf form, cornered the boy, his own flesh and blood, in a field. He had torn out his throat, and then he told the court he had
Peter
eaten his
Stump
brains.
was found guilty of witchcraft, of murder, of cannibalism, of incest. He was not just a criminal, he was a monster, a cancerous growth on the body of the community that had to be cut out with the most extreme and painful surgery imaginable. His execution was a masterpiece of medieval cruelty, a public spectacle of ritualistic purification designed to cleanse the land of his demonic stain. First, he was strapped to a great wagon wheel, and with red-hot pincers, the executioner tore great chunks of flesh from his body 10 separate times, a slow and agonizing deconstruction of the man. Then, with the back of a heavy wooden axe, they broke his arms and his legs, shattering the bones, ensuring he could never run again, either as a man or a wolf. While he was still alive, still conscious, still screaming, they beheaded him. And then his headless, mangled body was taken down and burned on a great pyre until nothing was left but ash and blackened bone. But the punishment did not end with him. His daughter and his mistress, convicted as his accomplices in depravity, were also burned alive at the stake, their screams a final, terrible chorus to his own. And finally, as a grim and eternal warning to any who might consider following his dark path, the wheel of his torture was set atop a high pole. His severed head was mounted on the very top, and surrounding it, as a final gruesome monument, were 16 pieces of wood representing the 16 known victims of his savagery. At the very center of it all, they placed a wooden effigy of a wolf. There it stood, a totem of terror, rotting in the sun and the rain, a testament to the fact that in this dark and fearful age, the monster was not just a story, the monster was real, and this was how you killed it.
The story of Peter Stump is a story of choice, a story of a man who willingly, eagerly sold his soul to the devil in exchange for the power to become a beast. His lycanthropy was a gift from hell, a conscious and deliberate pact with the forces of darkness. But as the werewolf myth continued its slow, bloody crawl through the centuries, a new and perhaps even more terrifying idea began to take hold in the human imagination. An idea that shifted the werewolf from the realm of the sinner to the realm of the sick. An idea that transformed the monster from a willing servant of evil into an unwilling victim of a contagious and incurable disease. This was the birth of the curse of the bite. This was a profound and terrifying evolution of the myth. It meant that you no longer had to seek out the devil in the deep woods.
You no longer had to sign a pact in your own blood. The curse could now find you. It could hunt you down. A single unfortunate encounter on a lonely road at night, a single moment of savage violence, a single wound, and your life was over. You were no longer just a victim. You were now a carrier, a walking, talking, and deeply tragic time bomb, just waiting for the next full moon to detonate, to transform you into the very thing that had destroyed you. This idea of a monstrous transformation being passed on like a sickness was not born in a vacuum. It was a dark and twisted reflection of the very real and very terrifying world in which these people lived. A world where sudden, inexplicable, and horrifying transformations were not just a matter of folklore, they were a matter of public health. The first and most obvious of these real-world horrors was rabies. Imagine you are a peasant in a 17th century French village. You live in a world that is intimately and often violently intertwined with the animal kingdom. And in that world, there is no disease more feared, more mysterious, and more utterly, completely terrifying than rabies. You have seen what it does. You have seen it in the dogs that guard your flocks, in the foxes that raid your henhouse, and most terrifyingly of all, in the wolves that haunt the forests that surround your village. You see a wolf, a creature that is normally a cunning, intelligent, and elusive predator, suddenly behave in a way that is profoundly and unnaturally wrong. It loses its fear of humans. It will wander into your village in broad daylight, its eyes glazed over, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. Its mouth is a mess of frothing, slobbering foam, and it is possessed by a single, mindless, and utterly terrifying urge to bite. It will attack anything that moves, other animals, livestock, and people, with a suicidal, unthinking ferocity. And you know what happens to the person who is bitten. You know that there is no cure. The bite itself is just the beginning. For weeks, perhaps even months, the person seems fine. The wound heals. The memory of the attack begins to fade. And then the sickness begins. It starts with a fever, a headache, a strange tingling sensation at the sight of the old wound. But then, the true horror unfolds. The person's personality begins to change. They become agitated, aggressive, paranoid. They develop a strange and terrifying aversion to water, a hydrophobia so profound that the mere sight or sound of it can send them into violent convulsions. Their throat muscles begin to spasm, making it difficult to speak or swallow. Their voice becomes a low, guttural growl, and in the final, agonizing stages, they lose their minds completely. They become a creature of pure, animalistic rage, thrashing, biting, and snapping at their own family, their own loved ones, who can only watch in helpless horror as the person they knew is consumed from the inside out by this savage, invisible beast. Now, look at this through the eyes of a person who has no knowledge of virology, of the microscopic world of germs and diseases. What do you see? You see a perfect, terrifying, and undeniable parallel to the werewolf myth. You see a human being bitten by a savage wolf who, over time, begins to lose their humanity and take on the characteristics of the very beast that attacked them. They become aggressive. Their voice becomes a growl. They are driven by a mindless, violent rage. They are, for all intents and purposes, transforming. The curse of the bite was not a fantasy. For the people of this time, it was a real, observable, and all too common tragedy. The werewolf myth was not just a story. It was the only explanation they had for the unexplainable horror of rabies. The disease provided a grim and bloody biological blueprint for the supernatural curse. But rabies was not the only real-world horror that was feeding the werewolf hysteria. There was another, even stranger and more insidious affliction that was turning entire communities mad. A sickness that did not come from the bite of an animal, but from the very bread that they ate. This was the curse of ergot poisoning, a phenomenon known in the Middle Ages as Saint Anthony's fire. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, a staple grain for the peasant populations of Europe. In years of cold, wet harvests, this fungus could spread, unseen, throughout the entire grain supply. And when the bread made from this tainted rye was eaten, the effects were devastating. Ergot contains a powerful psychoactive alkaloid, a natural chemical That is, in fact, the precursor to the modern hallucinogenic drug, LSD. And when an entire village was consuming this tainted bread day after day, the result was a form of mass collective psychosis. The symptoms were horrific. The afflicted would suffer from two main forms of the poisoning. The first was gangrenous. They would feel a sensation of intense burning heat in their limbs, the fire of Saint Anthony. Their hands and feet would turn black, become numb and mummified, and then, in a final gruesome act, they would simply fall off. But it was the second form, the convulsive form, that fed directly into the werewolf myth. The victims would suffer from violent, uncontrollable muscle spasms, their bodies twisting and contorting into unnatural positions. They would experience powerful, terrifying, and deeply realistic hallucinations. They would see monsters. They would see demons. They would believe that they were being attacked by invisible forces. And sometimes, in the depths of this psychedelic madness, they would believe that they themselves were transforming. They would experience a profound, delusional psychosis known as lycanthropy, a genuine, documented psychological condition where the sufferer believes that they are, in fact, a wolf. They would crawl on all fours. They would howl at the moon. They would hide in the forests and attempt to attack livestock or even other people, their minds completely lost in the powerful, waking nightmare that the poisoned bread had unleashed. Imagine it. An entire village slowly going mad. People's limbs are turning black and falling off. Others are running through the streets, howling and screaming, convinced that they are wolves, their minds shattered by the hallucinogenic poison they have been eating for weeks. To the rational modern mind, this is a tragic but explainable public health crisis. But to the medieval mind, a mind that was already primed to see the work of the devil in every shadow, this was not a sickness. This was a demonic infestation. This was an outbreak of witchcraft, of shape-shifting. The curse was spreading, not through a bite, but through the very food that was supposed to sustain them. And so, the idea of the contagious werewolf, the werewolf curse, as a sickness that could be passed from one person to another, became deeply, inextricably woven into the fabric of the European consciousness. It was a perfect, terrifying fusion of supernatural myth and real-world biological horror. This new, viral model of the werewolf created a new kind of social terror. The old, pact-based werewolf, the Peter Stump model, was a monster that was, in some sense, contained. He was a singular evil, a man who had chosen his own damnation. But the contagious werewolf was something far more insidious. It was a threat that could come from anywhere, from anyone. Your neighbor, your friend, even your own husband or wife could be the victim of a chance encounter in the woods and could now be a carrier of this monstrous plague, a ticking time bomb of animalistic rage just waiting to go off in your own home. The fear was no longer just of the wolf in the forest. It was now of the wolf in the heart of the community, the wolf that wore the skin of a familiar and beloved face. This new, viral model of lycanthropy turned every village into a powder keg of suspicion and paranoia. Every unexplained illness, every strange bout of aggressive behavior, every sudden death could now be interpreted as a sign of the curse. And this fear, this deep and abiding terror of a hidden, monstrous contagion living in their midst, demanded an answer. It demanded a defense. And so, just as the villagers of the past had developed a grim, ritualistic protocol for dealing with the undead strigoi, the people of this era began to develop their own set of desperate and often brutal rituals and remedies, a new and evolving science of how to expose, how to fight, and how to kill the living, breathing, and terrifyingly contagious werewolf. The witch hunt was about to become a wolf hunt. And the hunting grounds were not the dark forests of the wilderness, but the even darker and more treacherous landscape of the human soul. The fear was now a contagion. It had seeped through the cracks in the world and taken root in the heart of the community. The werewolf was no longer a distant myth, a monster from a story. It was a disease, a curse that could be passed on with a single, savage bite, a hidden plague that could be lurking behind the eyes of your friend, your neighbor, your own child. This new, terrifying reality demanded a new set of rules. a new and desperate science of survival. If the monster was real, then the weapons to fight it also had to be real. And so, in the terrified, flickering candlelight of peasant huts and the cold stone halls of inquisitors, a new and brutal form of folk magic was born. This was not the high, ceremonial magic of the scholars and the alchemists. This was a grim, practical, and bloody business. It was a set of rituals and remedies, a desperate, crowdsourced survival guide, passed down in hushed whispers from one generation to the next, on how to expose, how to repel, and ultimately, how to kill the werewolf. The first and most difficult problem was identification. How do you find the monster when, by day, it wears the face of a man? The werewolf was the ultimate sleeper agent, a creature of perfect and terrifying camouflage. But the old lore, the whispers of the grandmothers and the cunning men, offered a few subtle, telltale signs, a series of physical and behavioral tics that could, if you were observant enough, betray the beast hiding within the human skin. You were told to look at their hands. A true werewolf, even in human form, would have hands that were strangely broad, with fingers that were all of the same length, more like a paw than a human hand. You were told to look for a specific kind of bristle-like hair growing on the palms of their hands. You were told to look into their eyes. The eyes, they said, were the one part of the beast that could never fully disguise itself. A werewolf's eyes, even in the bright light of day, would hold a strange, deep, and feral gleam. And if you looked closely, you might see a faint, reddish reflection in their pupils, the last, lingering spark of the demonic fire that burned within them. You were told to look at their eyebrows. The old tales insisted that a werewolf's eyebrows would be long, thick, and would meet in the middle, forming a single, unbroken line above their eyes, a mark that was known as the monobrow, a classic physical sign of a wild, untamed, and bestial nature. And you were told to listen to them. They often had a low, rasping voice. They were said to be unnaturally thirsty. And they were prone to sudden, inexplicable fits of melancholy, of brooding silence, as if the human part of them was in a constant, losing battle with the savage beast that shared its soul. These were the subtle clues. But if a village was truly in the grip of a werewolf panic, if the livestock was being slaughtered and the children were disappearing, a more direct and more dangerous method of identification was required. This was the trial by ordeal, a brutal and often fatal test designed to force the monster to reveal itself. One of the most common methods was the ordeal by fire. The accused, the man or woman who was suspected of being the werewolf, would be cut. A small incision would be made on their forehead or their chest, often in the shape of a cross. The belief was that a true werewolf, a creature of demonic power, would be unable to bleed. Their unholy body would not shed the life-giving fluid that they so craved in others. If the accused did not bleed, or did not bleed enough in the eyes of the accusers, they were guilty. Another, even more direct method was to simply confront the suspected werewolf with the tools that were believed to be its undoing. A priest would hold a crucifix before their eyes. If the accused recoiled in terror, if they could not bear to look upon the holy symbol, it was a sign of the demonic presence within. Or, an accuser would suddenly brandish a piece of wolfsbane, the potent, poisonous, and magically charged herb, under the nose of the suspect. A violent allergic reaction, a fit of sneezing or coughing, was seen as proof that the beast within was reacting to the poison that could destroy it. But the most certain and most terrifying way to prove a man was a werewolf was to catch him in the act, or to wound the beast and then find the corresponding wound on the man. This was the terrible, damning evidence that had sealed the fate of Peter Stump. The hunters had cut off the wolf's paw, and they had found the man with a severed hand. It was an undeniable, supernatural fingerprint. This belief led to a new and terrible form of proactive, vigilante justice. If a village was being terrorized by a wolf, the men would no longer just hunt the beast. They would try to wound it, to mark it. They would try to cut off its paw, or to slash its flank, or to put an arrow in its leg. And then, the next day, they would go through the village, looking for the man with the wounded hand, the slashed side, the limp. And when they found him, they would have their monster. Once the werewolf was identified, the next desperate question was how to survive it. How do you protect your family, your home, from a creature of supernatural strength and savagery? The folklore provided a small, desperate arsenal of magical and spiritual remedies. The first line of defense was the church. Holy water, sprinkled on the doors and windows of a house, was believed to create a spiritual barrier that the demonic beast could not cross. A crucifix, hung over the bed, was a shield for the soul in the dark, vulnerable hours of the night. Prayer, constant and fervent, was a form of spiritual warfare, a direct appeal to the armies of heaven to protect the believer from the minions of hell. But the folk magic, the older, pre-Christian remedies, were often seen as more practical, more direct. Wolfsbane, also known as aconite, was the most powerful of all the werewolf repellents. It was a beautiful but deadly poisonous plant. It was believed that the werewolf, with its heightened animalistic senses, would be repulsed by the plant's potent, acrid smell. Bouquets of wolfsbane would be hung over doorways and windows. It would be woven into wreaths and placed around the necks of sleeping children. It was a fragile, floral, and deeply poisonous security system. Other plants were also believed to have protective properties. Mistletoe, the sacred plant of the ancient druids, was said to repel them. Rye, the very grain that could sometimes carry the curse of ergot, was also believed to be a protection against the werewolf if it was scattered on the doorstep. And the branches of the ash or the rowan tree, trees that were believed to be sacred and to have a deep connection to the spirit world, could be placed over a doorway to bar the monster's entry. And then there was iron, cold iron, the metal that represented civilization, technology, the power of man to shape the world to his will. It was seen as a direct and powerful antidote to the raw, chaotic, and untamed magic of the wilderness, the magic that the werewolf embodied. A simple iron knife placed under the threshold of a door was said to prevent a werewolf from entering a house. Blacksmiths, the masters of iron, were often seen as having a special power, a special protection against the forces of the night. But these were all defensive measures. They were the desperate, fearful acts of a people under siege. What happened when the defenses failed? What happened when the monster got inside? How do you kill a creature that is not quite human and not quite a beast? The law was very specific. The werewolf was a creature of supernatural power, and it could not be killed by normal, mortal weapons. An ordinary sword would not cut its hide, an ordinary arrow would not pierce its heart, and an ordinary bullet from an ordinary gun would have no effect. To kill the monster, you needed a special kind of weapon, a weapon that was imbued with its own form of magic, its own form of spiritual purity. You needed silver. The idea of silver as a weapon against the supernatural is ancient. Silver has long been associated with the moon, with purity, with incorruptibility. In alchemy, it was a noble metal, a symbol of the soul, and it was this symbolic spiritual purity that made it the perfect weapon against the corrupt, unholy, and demonic nature of the werewolf. The idea of the silver bullet is, in fact, a relatively modern invention, a product of 19th century fiction and 20th century cinema. But the core idea of silver as the werewolf's bane is much older. In the old stories, a knife with a silver blade, a sword with a silver hilt, or even a simple piece of silver, a coin or a crucifix, pressed against the creature's skin, was said to burn it like fire. To truly kill the beast, you had to pierce its heart with this pure, sacred metal. So you have your magical weapons, you have your folk remedies. But what did all of this mean in the real, brutal world of medieval justice? It meant that if you were accused of being a werewolf, you had almost no hope of survival. The trials of accused werewolves, which took place in great numbers in France and Germany during the height of the witch craze, were not legal proceedings. They were ritualistic purges. Imagine you are the accused. You have been identified through one of the crude, nonsensical methods of the folk tradition. You have been dragged from your home, thrown into a cold, dark, and filthy dungeon, and you are brought before the inquisitors. These are educated men of God, but their minds are completely and utterly convinced of the reality of your crime. They are not there to determine your guilt or innocence. They are there to extract a confession, to force you to admit your pact with the devil, and to name your accomplices. and they will use any means necessary to get that confession. They will torture you. The details of the torture are a litany of human cruelty. The rack, which would dislocate your every joint. The thumbscrews, which would crush the bones of your fingers. The strappado, which would rip your arms from their sockets. The burning irons, which would sear your flesh. Under this relentless, unimaginable agony, you would confess. Of course you would confess. You would confess to anything. You would tell them you had danced with the devil. You would tell them you had transformed into a wolf. You would name your neighbors, your friends, anyone, just to make the pain stop. And with your confession in hand, a confession that had been written by your torturers and that you had only signed with a scream, you would be found guilty, and you would be taken to the public square, and you would be burned alive at the stake. Your death a piece of grotesque public theatre, a terrifying sermon on the dangers of straying from the path of God. This was the grim, terrifying reality. The rituals and remedies, the folk magic and the witch trials were not just a collection of quaint and curious superstitions. They were a complete and functioning system of belief, a system that had the power of life and death. They were the desperate and often brutal attempts of a terrified society to impose order on a chaotic and frightening world. They were trying to fight a monster. And in their fear, in their paranoia, in their absolute and unshakable certainty, they often became the very monsters they were hunting. The line between the hunter and the hunted, between the righteous and the damned, became a bloody, indistinguishable blur. And in the smoke of the pyres, in the screams of the accused, the werewolf myth was no longer a story. It was a weapon that was being used with a terrible and tragic efficiency by humans against other humans. The werewolf is not one monster, it is a legion. While the inquisitors and the demonologists of the church were busy trying to force the creature into a neat, tidy and satanic box, the werewolf of the common people, the creature of the true ancient folklore, remained a wild, chaotic and wonderfully unpredictable beast. It was a creature that changed its shape, its methods, and its very meaning as it moved from one dark forest, from one mist-shrouded valley, from one isolated mountain village to the next. To truly understand the deep, primal power of this myth, we must leave the cold, hard certainty of the trial records and enter the darker, stranger, and more ambiguous world of the folk tale. This was a world where the stories were not written down in books. They were told. They were whispered by the fireside on long, dark winter nights. They were passed down from grandmother to grandchild, a precious and terrifying inheritance of oral tradition. And like any story that is told and retold, it changed, it adapted, it took on the specific fears, the specific anxieties, and the specific moral landscape of the people who were telling it. The werewolf of France was not the same as the werewolf of Germany, and both were profoundly different from the creature that haunted the dark, brooding forests of Eastern Europe. Let us travel first to the fields and forests of medieval France. Here, the creature was known as the loup-garou. The name itself is a beautiful tautological knot of language. Loup is the French word for wolf, and garou is a corruption of an older Frankish term, wari-wolf, which meant literally man-wolf. So the loup-garou was, redundantly, the wolf-man-wolf, a name that seems to emphasize the deep, inseparable and monstrous fusion of the two beings. The French loup-garou was, in many ways, the archetypal werewolf of the witch trials. It was almost always a creature born of a demonic pact. A man, or sometimes a woman, would, in a moment of despair or greed, sell their soul to the devil in exchange for the power to become a wolf. The transformation was often facilitated by a magical object, a wolfskin belt, a cursed strap of leather, or a foul, satanic ointment that had to be rubbed onto the naked body. This was a werewolf of sin, a creature born of a conscious and deliberate act of heresy. But the French folklore also contained a more tragic and sympathetic version of the monster. Sometimes the transformation was not a choice, but a curse. A man could be condemned to become a loup-garou as a form of divine punishment for a terrible sin, like the ancient Greek king Lycaon. Or, more commonly, he could be the victim of a witch's curse, an innocent man who had been transformed against his will. One of the most famous and beautiful of these tales is the story of Bisclavre, a lie, or a short narrative poem written by the 12th century poet Marie de France. It is not a story of a savage, cannibalistic monster. It is a tragic romance. Bisclavret is a noble and respected baron in Brittany, a man who is beloved by his king and adored by his beautiful wife. But he has a dark secret. For 3 days out of every week, he vanishes. His wife, consumed by curiosity and a growing fear, confronts him, begging him to tell her where he goes. After much resistance, he finally confesses. He tells her that he is a werewolf. For 3 days a week, he is forced to shed his human form and live in the deep woods as a great wolf. He explains that to transform back into a man, he needs his clothes. He hides them in a hollow stone near an old chapel in the woods. His wife is horrified, not by the fact that he is a werewolf, but by the physical, animalistic reality of it. Her love turns to revulsion, and she plots to betray him. She conspires with another knight, a man who has long desired her, and she tells him her husband's secret. The knight goes to the hollow stone, steals Bisclavret's clothes, and leaves him trapped forever in the form of a wolf. The wife then marries the knight, believing she is free of her monstrous husband. But Bisclavret, in his wolf form, is not a monster. He is still the same noble and gentle soul. He does not attack the local peasants or their livestock. He continues to live a quiet, sad life in the forest. One day, the king himself is out hunting, and his dogs corner the great, strange wolf. But the wolf does not fight back. Instead, it runs to the king. It licks his feet. It behaves with a gentle, intelligent submission that is utterly unlike any normal wolf. The king, amazed, sees the intelligence, the humanity in the beast's eyes. He calls off his dogs, and he adopts the wolf, taking it back to his castle, where it becomes his beloved and constant companion. The wolf lives peacefully at court, loved by all, until one day, the treacherous wife and her new husband, the knight, arrive for a great feast. The moment the wolf sees them, its gentle nature vanishes. It lunges, not at the knight, but at the wife, and in a single, savage and deeply symbolic act of retribution, it bites off her nose. The king and the entire court are stunned. This gentle, noble beast has never shown a hint of violence before. They realize that this is not a random attack. The wolf has a reason. Under questioning, the terrified wife confesses her crime. The king forces the knight to return the stolen clothes. They are brought to the wolf, but he will not change in front of them. The wise king has him taken to a private bedchamber, and a short while later the door opens, and out walks not the wolf, but the baron, Bisclavret, restored to his human form. The treacherous wife and her knight are banished from the kingdom, and the story says that all of her female descendants were born without noses, a physical, inherited mark of her sin. This story is a profound and beautiful exploration of the werewolf myth. It is a story that asks, what truly makes a man a monster? Is it the shape of his body or the nature of his soul? Bisclavret, in the body of a wolf, is more noble, more human than his beautiful but treacherous human wife. The true monster of the story is not the werewolf. It is the human being who betrays him. But as we travel east into the dark, brooding and deeply superstitious forests of Germany and the Slavic lands, this kind of moral complexity and romantic tragedy begins to fade, replaced by a much more raw, brutal and unambiguous horror. Here, the werewolf, or the vilkakis in Latvia, the vukodlak in Serbia, was rarely a tragic figure. It was a creature of pure, ravenous hunger and unrestrained, malevolent power. The stories here were not tragic romances. They were grim, bloody survival guides. The Eastern European werewolf was a creature that was deeply intertwined with the region's equally powerful and terrifying belief in vampires. In many of these cultures, the two monsters were not separate entities. They were two different stages of the same unholy and damnably persistent life cycle. It was believed that a man who was a werewolf in life, a man who had made a pact with the devil and had tasted human flesh, was doomed to become a vampire after his death. His soul was so corrupted, so deeply stained with the sin of his unnatural life that it could not find rest. He would rise from his grave, not as a wolf, but as a blood-drinking, walking corpse, to continue his war against the living. The werewolf and the vampire were two sides of the same cursed supernatural coin. A man who was a beast in life would become a monster in death. This belief created a profound sense of despair. It meant that even death was not an escape, either for the werewolf or for his victims. The terror did not end when the werewolf was finally hunted down and killed. That was just the beginning of the second act. The villagers then had to take the same gruesome, ritualistic precautions with the werewolf's corpse that they would with a suspected vampire's, to ensure that it would not rise again. They would have to decapitate the body, stuff its mouth with garlic, and drive a stake through its heart. It was a monster that had to be killed twice. And the werewolf of this region was a symbol of something far more than just simple, animalistic savagery. It was a symbol of a deep and profound spiritual sickness. It was a symbol of sin, of lust, and of the terrifying loss of humanity that came with giving in to your darkest, most bestial appetites. In the eyes of the church and in the minds of the deeply religious peasants, the werewolf was the ultimate embodiment of sin made flesh. The transformation into a wolf was a physical manifestation of a spiritual corruption. To become a werewolf was to reject God, to reject reason, to reject the very thing that made you human, and to embrace the raw, chaotic, and deeply sinful world of the animal. It was, in particular, a symbol of unrestrained, violent, and often sexual lust. The wolf, with its predatory nature, its connection to the wild, untamed forest, and its association with the night, was a powerful symbol of the untamed, animalistic passions that the church was so desperate to suppress. The act of transformation itself was often described in deeply sensual, almost erotic terms. The shedding of human clothes, the growth of fur, the raw, physical power of the new, bestial body. It was a release from the strict, suffocating rules of Christian morality. It was a story about the terrifying, seductive pleasure of giving in to your inner beast. And the werewolf's victims were often young women, their deaths described in terms that blurred the line between a predatory animal attack and a brutal sexual assault. The werewolf was the ultimate monstrous male predator, a creature of pure, unrestrained libido, a walking, snarling, and deeply terrifying symbol of the dangers of lust. And finally, the werewolf was a symbol of the profound and tragic loss of humanity itself. The most terrifying part of the werewolf story is not the violence, it is the moment after. The moment the sun rises and the transformed man wakes up, naked, shivering, and alone in the woods. He is covered in the blood of his victims, the taste of raw flesh still in his mouth. And he remembers everything. He remembers the hunt, he remembers the kill, he remembers the savage, ecstatic joy of his own monstrousness. This is the true horror of the medieval werewolf, the horror of the divided self, the horror of knowing that there is a monster living inside you, a monster that you cannot control, a monster that wears your face. It is the fear of looking in the mirror and seeing not the eyes of a man, but the eyes of a beast, staring back at you. The werewolf of folklore was not just one monster. It was a complex and contradictory tapestry of human fears. It was the tragic, noble beast of the French romance, a creature whose humanity was trapped in the body of a wolf. It was the ravenous, demonic, and soul-corrupted killer of the German and Slavic tales, a creature whose bestial nature was trapped in the body of a man. It was a symbol of sin, of lust, of a savage and terrifying freedom from the laws of God and man. It was the ultimate embodiment of our own, deeply ambivalent relationship with the animal inside us. The part of us that we fear, that we repress, that we try to civilize and to chain down, but also perhaps the part of us that we secretly, in our darkest and most honest moments, long to release. The werewolf is the story of that chain breaking. It is the story of the beast getting out. And it is a story that has been whispered in 1,000 different forms, in 1,000 different languages, for thousands of years, in the deep, dark, and wild places of the human soul. The old werewolf was dead, the creature of the witch trials, the demonic servant of Satan, the cannibalistic monster of the German pamphlets, had been tried, convicted, and burned at the stake of reason and modernity. The shambling, plague-ridden ghoul of Eastern European folklore had been dissected, explained away by science as a tragic misinterpretation of rabies and mental illness. For a time, it seemed as if the werewolf, as a source of genuine visceral terror, had been declawed, defanged, and relegated to the dusty, forgotten archives of a superstitious past. The monster was sleeping, but it was not dead. It was simply waiting for a new kind of magic, a new kind of darkness to dream it back into existence. And that magic would be found not in a grimoire of ancient spells, but in the flickering, hypnotic, and deeply powerful light of the motion picture. The 20th century was about to resurrect the werewolf, and in doing so, it would create a new, and perhaps even more terrifying, monster for a new and deeply anxious age. A monster that would be known forever as the Wolfman. The stage for this resurrection was set by Universal Studios in the 1930s and early 40s. In an era of economic depression and the looming shadow of a Second World War, the studio had found a gold mine in the darkness. They had unleashed a new pantheon of gods and monsters upon the world, creating the classic, iconic, and still definitive versions of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy. These were not the complex, ambiguous, and deeply psychological monsters of the original novels. These were the streamlined, archetypal, and deeply cinematic monsters of the Hollywood Dream Factory. And after the phenomenal success of these films, the studio went looking for another classic monster to add to its stable. They found the werewolf. But the werewolf presented a unique challenge. Unlike Dracula or Frankenstein, there was no single, great, defining novel to adapt. There was only a chaotic, contradictory, and often gruesome mess of ancient folklore. There was no clear, consistent set of rules. So the studio, and in particular, the brilliant German-Jewish screenwriter Kurt Siodmak, a man who had fled the very real and very modern monsters of Nazi Germany, had to invent them. Siodmak was a man who understood fear. He understood the horror of being an outsider, of being persecuted for something you could not control. And he understood the deep psychological terror of a good man being transformed, against his will, into a monster. He took the scattered, bloody bones of the old European folklore, and he assembled them into a new, sleek, and tragically modern skeleton. And upon that skeleton, he built a new and deeply sympathetic kind of werewolf. A werewolf that the audience would not just fear, but would pity and perhaps even identify with. This was the birth of the tragic, cursed, and deeply human werewolf. The film that would unleash this new monster upon the world was The Wolfman, released in 1941. And at its heart was not a monster, but a man. A man named Lawrence Talbot, played with a sad, gentle, and deeply soulful vulnerability by Lon Chaney Jr. Talbot is not a sinner, he is not a sorcerer. He is a normal, decent, and thoroughly modern man. He is an American, an engineer, who has returned to his ancestral home in Wales after the death of his brother. He is an outsider, a man of science and reason, returning to a land that is still steeped in old-world superstition and misty Gothic folklore. And he is a man who, through a single, heroic, and deeply fateful act, becomes the victim of a terrible, ancient curse. Imagine the scene. It is a foggy, moonlit night. Talbot is walking through the woods with a young woman he has just met. They are attacked by a huge, wolf-like creature. Talbot, in a desperate act of courage, beats the beast to death with his silver-headed walking cane. But in the struggle, he is bitten. He survives. But the old gypsy woman, Maleva, whose son was the wolf that attacked him, comes to him with a grim and terrible prophecy. She looks at the bite mark on his chest, a wound in the shape of a 5-pointed star, a pentagram, and she tells him the terrible truth. Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night, she intones, in a voice heavy with ancient sorrow, may become a wolf when the wolf's bane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. And with that single poetic and beautifully crafted piece of invented folklore, Siodmak established the new, immutable laws of the werewolf. The curse is spread by a bite. It is a contagion, and the transformation is not a matter of will or of a magic belt. It is an involuntary astrological event tied to the cyclical, mystical power of the transformation scene in The Wolfman is a masterpiece of early special effects, a slow, agonizing, and deeply tragic process. It is not a sudden, explosive change. It is a painful, frame-by-frame dissolution of the human form. Through a series of painstaking dissolves, we watch as Lon Chaney Jr.'s familiar human face begins to change. Hair sprouts on his hands and his face. His nose flattens, his teeth elongate, his features contort into a bestial lupine mask. And all the while, his eyes, the human eyes of Larry Talbot, remain filled with a look of pure, agonizing terror. He is a man who is conscious of his own monstrous transformation, a prisoner in his own body, watching in helpless horror as the beast from within takes over. This was a profound and terrifying new idea. The werewolf was no longer a man who became a wolf. He was now a man who was trapped inside a wolf. The human consciousness, the soul of Larry Talbot, was still in there, a terrified passenger in a murderous, hairy vehicle that he could not control. The true horror of the Wolfman was not the monster he became, but the good man he ceased to be. And the new rules that Siodmak created would become the absolute, unshakable gospel of the werewolf myth for the next 80 years. The first and most important of these rules was the full moon. The idea that a werewolf only transforms under the light of the full moon is not a part of the ancient folklore. In the old stories, a werewolf could often change his shape at will, or the transformation was tied to a specific ritual or a magic object. But Siodmak, in a stroke of pure poetic genius, tied the curse to the most powerful and mystical symbol of the night. The moon, with its cyclical phases of birth, death, and rebirth, became the engine of the transformation. It was a beautiful, powerful, and deeply cinematic idea. The full moon was no longer just a source of light. It was a trigger, a death sentence, delivered once a month. The second rule was the silver bullet. As we have seen, the idea of silver as a weapon against the werewolf was an old one, but the specific, iconic image of the silver bullet was a creation of the modern age, cemented in the public imagination by this film. It was the perfect fusion of old-world superstition and new-world technology, the ancient, magical, and purifying power of silver, delivered with the clean, efficient, and deadly force of a modern firearm. It was the only thing that could kill the beast, but it was also, in a deeply tragic sense, the only thing that could save the man. The silver bullet was not just a weapon, it was a mercy. It was the only cure for a disease that was worse than death. And so, the Wolfman was born, a new, tragic, and deeply sympathetic monster for a modern, psychoanalytic age. He was a creature that embodied the new anxieties of the 20th century. He was no longer a symbol of sin or heresy. He was a symbol of the divided self, of the Freudian concept of the id, the primal, animalistic urges that lurk just beneath the thin, fragile surface of our civilized consciousness. Larry Talbot is a good man. He is a symbol of the rational, modern ego. But the wolf is the beast within, the repressed rage, the sexual desire, the violent, savage part of his own nature that he has been taught to deny. And the full moon is the trigger, the catalyst that causes that repressed part of himself to erupt, to take over, and to run wild. The Wolfman is a story about the terrifying and often tragic consequences of repression. It is a story that suggests that if you try to deny the beast within you, if you try to lock it away in the dark, it will eventually break free and it will destroy everything you love. The film was a huge success, and it cemented the werewolf as a key member of the Universal Monsters pantheon. Lon Chaney Jr., like Bela Lugosi before him, would become inextricably linked with the role, playing the tortured Larry Talbot in a series of sequels and monster mashups throughout the 1940s. He was the definitive Wolfman, his sad, hangdog face a perfect mask for the inner torment of the character. But as the decades wore on, the Wolfman, like Dracula before him, began to lose his bite. The slow, dissolving transformation scenes that had been so groundbreaking in 1941 began to look quaint and old-fashioned. The monster himself, a man in a simple yak hair costume, began to look less like a terrifying beast and more like a man in a shaggy suit. For the werewolf to be truly scary again, for a new, more cynical and more visually sophisticated generation, he would have to be reborn. And that rebirth would happen in the early 1980s, in a stunning 1-2 punch of cinematic innovation. In 1981, 2 groundbreaking films were released that would completely and utterly revolutionize the werewolf mythos, particularly the one thing that had become the most tired and cliché part of the story, the transformation. The first was Joe Dante's The Howling. The transformation scene in this film was a quantum leap forward. It was a full-body, on-screen metamorphosis, a masterpiece of practical special effects, of air bladders, of latex, of prosthetic appliances. You saw the man's skin bubble and stretch, his bones crack and reform, his snout elongate, his ears migrate to the top of his head. It was a painful, agonizing, and deeply visceral process. But it was the second film, John Landis's An American Werewolf in London, that would create the single most spectacular, most horrifying, and still, to this day, most influential transformation scene in the history of cinema. The film's hero, David Kessler, bitten by a werewolf on the lonely moors of England, undergoes his first transformation in a brightly lit London apartment. There is no hiding in the shadows. There are no gentle dissolves. The camera watches in a single, unflinching, long take as his body is torn apart and rebuilt from the inside out. His hands stretch and contort, the bones breaking and reforming with audible, sickening cracks. His spine elongates, ripping through the skin of his back. His face pushes forward into a lupine muzzle, his screams of pure, unimaginable agony slowly morphing into the guttural snarls of a beast. It is one of the most painful and terrifying sequences ever put on film. It took the psychological, internal horror of Lon Chaney Jr.'s transformation, and it made it brutally, graphically, and unforgivably physical. After this film, a simple dissolve would no longer be enough. The werewolf transformation was now, forever, a body horror masterpiece. The Wolfman had arrived. He had been born in the folklore of a forgotten age, given a name and a set of rules by a terrified German screenwriter, and then he had been born again, and again, in the dark, magical womb of the cinema. He had been transformed from a tragic, sympathetic victim into a creature of pure, visceral, body-shredding horror. The modern werewolf was now complete. He was a tragic, cursed man, bitten and infected against his will. He was a creature of the full moon, a slave to the celestial cycles. He could only be killed by the cold, clean, and merciful touch of silver. And his transformation was not a magical, instantaneous event, but a painful, agonizing, and deeply physical ordeal, a biological crucifixion that he was forced to endure, month after agonizing month. The 20th century had not just resurrected the monster, it had perfected him. It had created a new, modern, and deeply powerful myth, a myth that would become the absolute, non-negotiable template for almost every werewolf story that would follow. The howling had begun, and it would never stop. In the dark, haunted pantheon of the night, there are two kings, two apex predators, two ancient and immortal monarchs who rule over their respective kingdoms of fear. On one throne sits the vampire, the creature of cold, calculating, and aristocratic evil. He is the ghost in the tuxedo, the seducer, the manipulator, the monster who conquers not with brute force, but with a whisper, a glance, a promise of eternal, damned life. And on the other throne sits the werewolf, the creature of raw, primal, and uncontrollable savagery. He is the beast in the blood, the berserker, the force of nature, the monster who conquers not with a plan, but with tooth and claw, with a blind and ecstatic rage that tears the world apart. They are the twin titans of our nightmares, and for centuries, in our stories, in our folklore, and in the deepest, most primal parts of our imagination, they have been locked in an eternal and deeply symbolic war. Werewolves versus vampires. It is more than just a monster movie showdown. It is a profound and ancient rivalry, a conflict that is not just about two different kinds of monsters, but about two fundamentally different and eternally opposed kinds of horror. It is the timeless, bloody battle between the beast without and the beast within, between the curse of the body and the corruption of the soul. To understand why they are so often pitted against each other, why they are seen as the natural, eternal enemies of the night, we must first understand why they are such perfect, terrifying opposites. They are two sides of the same, dark, supernatural coin. They are the yin and the yang of our deepest fears. Consider their nature. The vampire is a creature of order, of control. He is, at his core, a creature of the mind. His horror is the horror of the aristocracy, of the old, corrupt, and decadent power that has been passed down through the bloodlines for centuries. He is a nobleman, a count, a prince. He lives in a castle, a symbol of ancient, established power. He is intelligent, he is cunning, he is a master strategist, a creature who thinks in terms of centuries, not moments. His evil is a cold, patient, and deeply intellectual evil. He is the monster of the chessboard, always thinking 3 moves ahead. The werewolf, in stark contrast, is a creature of pure, unadulterated chaos. He is the monster of the mob, the peasant, the common man. He is a creature of the body, of instinct, of raw, untamed, and uncontrollable emotion. His horror is the horror of the beast, of the savage, untamed wilderness that the vampire's castle is designed to keep out. He does not live in a castle. He lives in the dark, tangled forest, in the cave, in the earth itself. He does not plot. He does not plan. He is a creature of pure, mindless, and ecstatic rage. He is the monster of the berserker's charge, a living, breathing, and screaming embodiment of pure, destructive impulse. The vampire represents the horror of a humanity that has been lost to a cold, calculating, and eternal corruption. The vampire remembers being human. He remembers love. He remembers loss. He remembers the warmth of the sun. And it is this memory that makes his eternal, cold, and lonely existence a form of hell. He is a ghost, a walking, talking corpse, haunted by the memory of a life he can never reclaim. His tragedy is the tragedy of eternal consciousness trapped in a dead body. The werewolf represents the horror of a humanity that is not lost, but is temporarily and violently suppressed. The human is still in there, a terrified, screaming prisoner inside the beast. The horror of the werewolf is the horror of the divided self, of the good man who is forced, month after agonizing month, to become a passenger in his own body as it is turned into a murderous, savage weapon. His tragedy is the tragedy of a living, conscious soul that is periodically and brutally overwritten by the raw, animalistic code of the monster. They are the perfect Freudian monsters. The vampire is the superego, the cold, calculating, and often repressive voice of aristocratic control and social order, twisted into a monstrous, predatory form. The werewolf is the id, the primal, instinctual, and savage desires of the subconscious, unleashed in all its raw, bloody, and unrestrained glory. Their methods of predation are a study in contrasts. The vampire is a seducer. His attack is an act of intimate and often deeply erotic violation. It is the kiss, the bite, the slow, sensual draining of life. He is a monster of the bedroom, of the locked room, of the private, vulnerable spaces. He is a creature of a quiet, creeping, and deeply personal horror. The werewolf is a destroyer. His attack is not a seduction, it is a slaughter. It is an act of explosive, indiscriminate, and bestial violence. It is the ripping, the tearing, the dismemberment. He is a monster of the open spaces, of the lonely road, of the dark forest. He is a creature of a loud, chaotic, and public horror. The vampire leaves behind 2 small, neat puncture marks on the neck of his victim. The werewolf leaves behind a scene of almost unimaginable carnage, a bloody, visceral testament to its raw, explosive power. Even their relationship to their own monstrousness is a perfect opposition. The vampire, in most modern interpretations, chooses his damnation. He embraces his dark power. He revels in his immortality, in his superiority over the cattle that he feeds on. He is a willing participant in his own evil. The werewolf is almost always an unwilling victim. He is a cursed man. He does not choose his fate. It is forced upon him by the bite of another. He fights against the beast within. He dreads the coming of the full moon. He is a man at war with himself, a tragic figure who is both the victim and the villain of his own story. The vampire is a story of damnation as a form of power. The werewolf is a story of damnation as a form of suffering. And so it is no surprise that in our stories, these 2 perfect polar opposites are so often locked in a state of eternal, bloody conflict. They are natural enemies. They are 2 rival predators, competing for the same limited resource, the blood and the life of humanity. This rivalry is not a new invention of modern pop culture. It has deep, if often subtle, roots in the old folklore. In many parts of Eastern Europe, the same dark, magical forces that could create a werewolf were also believed to be responsible for the creation of a vampire. They were two different manifestations of the same, underlying, supernatural disease. And in some legends, as we have seen, the werewolf in life was doomed to become a vampire after its death, its soul so thoroughly corrupted that it could not find peace even in the grave. This created a natural and deeply personal animosity. The vampires, the established aristocratic undead, would see the werewolves, the savage, chaotic shapeshifters, as their bastard cousins, as a lower, more bestial form of their own dark race. And the werewolves would see the vampires as their own grim and inevitable future, a fate they were desperately trying to avoid. But it was in the 20th century, in the shared cinematic universe of the Universal monster movies, that this rivalry was truly codified and brought to the forefront. In the 1943 film Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, we see the tragic, cursed Larry Talbot, the Wolfman, desperately searching for a cure for his condition. He believes that the only person who can help him is the brilliant, deceased Dr. Frankenstein. But instead of finding the doctor, he finds the doctor's monstrous creation. And in the film's climax, the two monsters, the Wolfman and Frankenstein's creature, engage in a brutal, tragic battle, two lost and tormented souls trying to destroy each other. A few years later, in the film House of Dracula, the unholy trinity was complete. Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein's monster all shared the screen, and here the battle lines were drawn. The film establishes a clear, antagonistic relationship between the cold, calculating Count Dracula and the tortured, emotional Larry Talbot. Dracula offers Talbot a cure, but it is a lie, a trick to get Talbot into his power. The two monsters are presented as natural, ideological opposites, and their inevitable clash would set the stage for a century of cinematic conflict. This rivalry would become the central, driving force of a new generation of horror films. The Underworld film series created a complex, centuries-long secret war between the Death Dealers, an ancient and technologically advanced race of aristocratic vampires, and the Lycans, a once enslaved race of werewolves. The series transformed the old, gothic rivalry into a sleek, modern, and action-packed science fiction epic. The vampires were the cool, detached, and disciplined fascists clad in black leather. The werewolves were the rebellious, emotional, and savage freedom fighters. It was a story of class warfare, of racial prejudice, of a supernatural civil war that had been raging in the shadows of our own world for 1,000 years. The Twilight series, while softening the horror into a romantic saga, also used this ancient rivalry as a key plot point. The vampires were the cold, pale, and impossibly beautiful Cullen family, a symbol of old money, of detached, intellectual grace. The werewolves were the hot-blooded, passionate, and fiercely loyal Quileute tribe, a symbol of earthy, primal, and community-based power. The rivalry between them was not just a monster-on-monster conflict, it was a battle for the soul of the series' human protagonist, a supernatural love triangle that played on the ancient, symbolic opposition between the two creatures. Why does this conflict resonate so deeply with us? Because it is not just a story about two monsters fighting, it is a story about the fundamental and often violent conflicts within our own society and within our own souls. It is a story of order versus chaos. The vampires represent the rigid, often oppressive structures of civilization, the aristocracy, the corporation, the government. The werewolves represent the untamed, chaotic, and often violent forces of nature, of rebellion, of the revolution that seeks to tear down those structures. It is a story of the eternal struggle between the castle and the forest. It is a story of the mind versus the body. The vampire is the cold, detached intellectual, a creature who has transcended the messy, emotional needs of the flesh. The werewolf is the pure physical being, a creature who is a slave to the passions, the rages, and the hungers of its own body. It is a conflict that plays out in our own lives every day, the struggle between our rational, logical minds and our own, often irrational and self-destructive, physical desires. And it is a story of the rich versus the poor, of the aristocrat versus the peasant, of the master versus the slave. The vampire is almost always a creature of immense wealth and privilege, a landlord, a count, a ruler. The werewolf is almost always a creature of the common people, a peasant, a farmer, a tormented and unwilling outcast. Their war is a supernatural class war, a bloody and often tragic allegory for the real-world struggles between the powerful and the powerless. The eternal rivalry between the werewolf and the vampire endures because they are the perfect dark reflection of our own divided nature. They are the two great warring tribes that live inside every single one of us. We all have a part of us that is the vampire, the part that is cold, calculating, that craves power and control, that sometimes looks upon the messy, emotional world of others with a cool, detached and aristocratic disdain. And we all have a part of us that is the werewolf, the part that is wild, that is passionate, that is capable of great, unrestrained joy and of terrible, explosive rage, the beast that we try so hard to keep chained up in the basement of our own soul. The war between them is the war for our own identity. Will we be ruled by the cold, calculating logic of the mind or by the hot, savage passions of the body? Will we choose the path of eternal, lonely control or the path of wild, destructive freedom? The werewolf and the vampire are the two great, monstrous extremes of the human condition, and their eternal, bloody battle is the story of our own, endless struggle to find a balance between the two, to find a way to be both human and, in our own way, a little bit of a monster too. The dark, primeval forests have been cut down, replaced by the sterile geometric grids of our cities. The small, isolated villages, huddled in fear around their flickering fires, have been swallowed by the bright, noisy, and relentlessly connected global village. We live in an age of science, of reason, of instant information, an age of satellites that watch us from the heavens and screens that watch us in our own homes. We have, it would seem, banished the shadows. We have, in our arrogance, declared the monsters to be dead, and yet, the werewolf is still here. It has survived. It has adapted. It has followed us out of the dark woods and into the cold, hard, and unforgiving wilderness of the modern world. It no longer haunts the lonely traveler on a forgotten forest path. It now haunts the lonely commuter on a deserted late-night subway. It no longer stalks the edges of a peasant village. It now stalks the back alleys of our sprawling, concrete jungles. The monster has not died. It has simply learned to live in a new kind of forest, a new kind of darkness. And in our strange, chaotic, and often brutal modern world, it has perhaps found a more comfortable and more terrifying home than ever before. The werewolf is still a creature of our popular culture. It is a constant, snarling, and deeply profitable presence in our movies, our television shows, our video games, our novels. It has been a tragic, romantic hero, an action movie commando, a high school basketball player, a political metaphor. But in its purest, most effective modern forms, it has returned to its ancient, terrifying roots. It has become, once again, a symbol of pure, unrestrained, and deeply personal horror. Modern horror films have stripped away the gothic romance and the tragic sympathy of the old Universal movies and have instead focused on the sheer, visceral, body-shredding terror of the transformation itself. They have used the magic of modern special effects to make the ancient curse a tangible, physical, and deeply gruesome reality. The modern werewolf is not a man in a shaggy suit. It is a masterpiece of biological horror, a creature of snapping bone, of tearing flesh, of a human body being violently, agonizingly, and unforgivably rewritten into a new and monstrous form. The horror is no longer just in what the monster does. The horror is in what the monster is, in the sheer, unnatural, and deeply painful process of its own becoming. But the werewolf does not just live on our screens. It lives still in the whispers, in the rumors, in the strange, unsettling corners of our modern world. It lives in our urban legends. In the American Midwest, particularly in the states of Wisconsin and Michigan, people tell stories of a creature known as the Dogman. It is not a traditional werewolf. It is something else, something that seems to be a strange, modern mutation of the ancient myth. It is described as a 7-foot-tall, bipedal, canine-like creature with the body of a man and the head of a wolf or a German shepherd. It has thick, dark fur, glowing eyes, and a terrifying human-like scream. The sightings of this creature are remarkably consistent. People, often hunters or late-night drivers, report seeing it on lonely, rural roads, standing in the glare of their headlights, a tall, dark, and impossibly real figure. It does not attack. It just watches, a silent, menacing sentinel, before melting back into the darkness. The first officially recorded sighting of the Michigan dogman was in 1887, but the legend has seen a massive resurgence in the internet age, with dozens of new, terrified eyewitness accounts appearing online every year. Is it a hoax? Is it a mass delusion? A piece of regional folklore that has been amplified by the internet? Or is it something else? Is it a genuine modern-day manifestation of the ancient shape-shifting terror, a new kind of werewolf for a new kind of wilderness? And then there are the alleged sightings, the strange, unsettling reports that continue to trickle in from all over the world. People still claim to see them, large, wolf-like creatures that move with an unnatural speed and intelligence, creatures that seem to be more than just animals. In the remote, rural parts of Brazil, a country with a rich and terrifying folklore of its own, the lobisomum, the werewolf, is still a very real and very present fear. Farmers will report their livestock being slaughtered in a way that no normal predator would kill. And sometimes they will find strange, large, not quite human footprints in the mud. These are not stories for tourists. This is a genuine and sometimes deadly part of their everyday reality. But the true, enduring power of the werewolf today is not in the possibility that it might still exist as a physical creature, lurking in the shadows of our world. The true power of the werewolf, the reason it remains so potent, so relevant, so utterly unkillable, is that it is the single greatest and most terrifying metaphor that we have ever created for the monster that we all know, for a fact, is real. The monster that lives inside every single one of us. The werewolf is the perfect and most brutal metaphor for rage. We have all felt it. That sudden, white-hot and completely irrational surge of pure animalistic fury. A feeling so powerful that it momentarily eclipses our reason, our morality, our very sense of self. It is the beast that awakens when we are cut off in traffic, when we are betrayed by someone we love, when we feel the crushing weight of a world that is unfair, unjust, and unforgiving. It is a desire to lash out, to break things, to howl at the sheer, maddening injustice of it all. For most of us, this feeling is a fleeting and terrifying glimpse into the abyss of our own potential for violence. We feel the beast stir, we feel its claws scratching at the inside of our own skin, but we manage, through a lifetime of social conditioning, of repression, of sheer, desperate willpower, to keep the cage locked. We push the monster back down into the dark, silent basement of our own soul. But the werewolf is the story of what happens when the lock breaks. It is the story of a man who can no longer contain his own rage, a man whose inner, emotional fury becomes so powerful that it literally tears his own body apart and reshapes him into a physical manifestation of his own anger. The transformation is the ultimate loss of control. It is a surrender to the beast, and in that surrender there is a terrifying and perhaps even seductive kind of freedom. The freedom to destroy, to kill, to act without consequence, without conscience, without remorse. The Werewolf is a story that asks a deeply uncomfortable question. What would you do if for one night you were given the power to act on your darkest, most violent impulses, with no fear of punishment, and with no memory of your actions in the morning? It is a question that forces us to confront the terrifying and often unspoken violence that lurks just beneath the thin, fragile surface of our own civilized minds. The werewolf is also a powerful and deeply tragic metaphor for addiction. Consider the cycle. The man, the addict, is a good person, a person who loves his family, who wants to live a normal life, but he has a sickness, a curse that he cannot control. And when the trigger arrives, the full moon, the craving, the overwhelming need, he transforms. He becomes a different person, a monster, A person who is driven by a single, all-consuming and self-destructive hunger. In the grip of his addiction, he does terrible things. He hurts the people he loves. He destroys his own life. He becomes a creature of pure, selfish, and animalistic need. And then, the morning comes. The drug wears off. The transformation reverses. And he is left, a shivering, naked, and deeply ashamed human being lying in the wreckage of what the beast has done. He is filled with remorse, with guilt, with a desperate, soul-crushing desire to be free of the curse. He swears he will never do it again, but he knows, with a cold, hollow certainty, that the moon will rise again. The craving will return, and the beast is just sleeping, waiting. This is a story that has played out in millions of homes, in millions of lives. It is the story of the alcoholic, of the drug addict, of anyone who has ever been a slave to a power that is stronger than their own will. The werewolf is the perfect, heartbreaking symbol of the good person who is trapped in a destructive, cyclical, and seemingly inescapable dance with their own inner demon. And finally, the werewolf today is the ultimate metaphor for the beast within. For the simple, undeniable, and often terrifying fact that we are animals. We are a species that is capable of writing poetry, of composing symphonies, of contemplating the vast, silent beauty of the cosmos. But we are also a species that is capable of unimaginable cruelty, of genocide, of a savagery that would make any wolf in the forest recoil. We build cities of glass and steel. We create laws and religions and philosophies. We do everything in our power to build a wall between ourselves and the animal kingdom, to convince ourselves that we are something different, something better, something more. But the werewolf is the story that reminds us that this wall is a fiction. It is a fragile, paper-thin illusion. And that just beneath the surface of our tailored suits, our polite conversations, our civilized rituals, the beast is still there. It is in our DNA. It is in our blood. It is in the ancient reptilian part of our brain that still dreams of the hunt, of the taste of blood, of the raw, ecstatic freedom of the wild. The werewolf endures because it is the most honest of all our monsters. The vampire is a fantasy of eternal life and aristocratic power. Frankenstein's monster is a tragedy of scientific hubris. But the werewolf is us. It is the truest, darkest, and most honest reflection of our own divided nature. It is the terrifying and perhaps even liberating story of what we are and what we are capable of when the thin leash of our civilization finally snaps. And so, the howl in the night continues. It is no longer just the sound of a predator in the distant dark woods. It is the sound of a car horn blaring in a fit of road rage. It is the sound of a drunken, angry shouting match in the apartment next door. It is the silent, internal scream of a person fighting a losing battle with their own addiction. It is the sound of the evening news, a relentless nightly catalogue of the savage, bestial, and often inexplicable acts of violence that our own species inflicts upon itself. The monster is not a myth, it is not a story, it is real, and it is not hiding in the forest, it is hiding behind a pair of human eyes. It might be hiding behind the eyes of your neighbor, your friend, your lover, and the most terrifying thought of all, the thought that will keep you awake on the night of the next full moon, is that it might just be hiding behind your own.